In March 1944, 76 men tunneled out of a German prison camp.
A Nazi prison camp, an impenetrable fortress. And then, suddenly, silence. In the dead of night, dozens of Allied airmen disappeared without a trace from the most secure prison camp in Europe. No alarms, no gunfire, just empty beds and open questions. What really happened inside that camp? Why did so many never return? And why are the answers only surfacing now, over 70 years later? You think you know this story? You've seen the movie, heard the legends, but the truth, buried for decades, is more shocking than fiction. The prison camp that shouldn't fail. Tucked deep in the pine forests of Nazi-occupied Poland, Stalag Luft 3 didn't look like the site of a covert rebellion. Surrounded by snow-dusted trees and silent watchtowers, it resembled more of a grim military academy than a brutal prison. But appearances were deceiving. Constructed in 1942 near the small town of Sagan, it was designed by the Luftwaffe to be escape-proof, a fortress tailored specifically for the most problematic Allied prisoners of war. And those prisoners weren't just any soldiers. They were pilots, bombardiers, officers who had already proven themselves dangerous, not just in the sky, but behind barbed wire. From its inception, Stalag Luft 3 was a psychological weapon. The huts stood elevated on stilts to make tunnel digging more difficult. Sensitive microphones were buried around the perimeter to detect even the faintest vibrations underground. The sandy subsoil was intentionally selected because of its instability. Dig too far, and your tunnel would collapse. Guard towers watched every angle of the compound, with machine guns ready to fire on the first sign of movement near the fences. Two parallel fences stood 1.5 meters apart, with a barbed wire barrier between them, and patrols were relentless. And yet, despite all these precautions, Stalag Luft 3 didn't resemble a torture chamber. Far from it. Because the Luftwaffe, not the SS, ran the camp, there was an air of reluctant professionalism. Most of the guards were themselves former aviators. They respected their prisoners. The captured Allied officers received marginally better treatment than infantry POWs elsewhere. Within the northern compound, the future site of the escape, the prisoners organized concerts, maintained a theater, read books from a surprisingly well-stocked library, and even swam laps in a small pool. There were sports fields, makeshift clubs, and lectures. But make no mistake, this wasn't contentment. It was containment. And for many inside, comfort was simply camouflage. The Germans believed that boredom and routine would erode the prisoner's edge. That soft treatment would sap the will to resist. But what they didn't account for was the tenacity of the minds they had locked away. Many of these airmen were problem solvers by training, navigators, engineers, translators. For them, captivity was not a pause. It was a puzzle. And Stalag Luft 3, for all its security, was still a puzzle that could be solved. Far from breaking their spirit, the conditions at the camp forged it. A secret alliance formed between the most determined prisoners, those who refused to accept their cages. These were men who understood the risk. They knew what the Gestapo did to escapees, but they also understood something deeper, that every successful escape pulled German resources away from the front lines, that every tunnel dug in Sagan could save Allied lives somewhere else. And then came Roger Bushell, a South African-born RAF pilot with an iron will and piercing intellect. Bushell had been captured after his Spitfire was shot down over France. But he was no ordinary prisoner. Known by friend and foe alike as Big X, Bushell was already infamous for his escapes. Once, he'd nearly made it into Switzerland. Another time, he'd vanished into Prague and lived undercover for months. By the time he was transferred to Stalag Luft III, the Nazis knew his name. So did the prisoners. And when Bushel stood before them in the northern compound, he didn't talk about hope or freedom. He talked about obligation. Escape, he said, was not optional. It was a duty, a military mission, no different from flying a sortie. He didn't want one man to escape. He wanted hundreds. He wanted the biggest prison break in history. And he had a plan. Bushel's vision wasn't just bold, it was monumental. Not one tunnel, but three. Three massive, reinforced, camouflaged tunnels beneath the camp's foundations. If one was discovered, the other two could continue. If two were found, the third would still be ready. And from each would emerge not just brave men, but chaos. Bushel wanted the Germans to panic. He wanted them to divert trains, deploy thousands of soldiers, launch manhunts, and lose precious time. He didn't just want to escape. He wanted to disrupt an empire. But how do you build 3 tunnels under a camp that detects the sound of a spoon hitting dirt? A secret city beneath the camp. From the outside, Stalag Luft III looked like an impenetrable prison, but just beneath the surface, it was quietly transforming into something extraordinary. Beneath the snow and soil of the northern compound, hundreds of Allied prisoners were constructing a hidden world. A network of tunnels so elaborate, it rivaled the infrastructure of a small town. It was an engineering marvel, born in silence, darkness, and desperation. The plan? Build not 1, but 3 tunnels simultaneously. Roger Bushel knew the odds. He understood that if a single tunnel was discovered, the entire mission would be compromised. So he hedged his bets. Each tunnel was given a simple, easy-to-remember name: Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom began beneath a dark corner of one hut. Dick was concealed beneath a drainage sump in a washroom. Harry, the tunnel that would ultimately be used for the escape, was hidden under a metal stove in Hut 104. The stove burned hot, discouraging guards from inspecting too closely. Each tunnel was dug over 30 feet deep, far beneath the reach of the German microphones buried along the camp's perimeter. But digging was only the beginning. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were full-fledged transportation corridors. Lighting was strung along the ceiling using wires stolen from hut fixtures. Candles made from scavenged mutton fat lit the narrow passageways. Ventilation systems were cobbled together using hundreds of powdered milk tins, flattened, joined, and stretched the length of the tunnel like industrial ductwork. Even the tunnel rails were handcrafted. Bed frames were stripped and reassembled into trolley tracks. Small wooden carts, fitted with scavenged wheels, carried out sand and hauled in tools and support materials. These tunnels weren't just exits. They were arteries in a living organism. It took a massive force to bring the operation to life. Nearly 600 prisoners played a role. The diggers, of course, worked at the tunnel's front lines, but behind them was a hidden workforce just as critical. The penguins, named for the awkward way they waddled, carried bags of yellow sand under their trousers and scattered it around the compound to blend with the gray topsoil. Forgers crafted travel documents, IDs, and railway permits by candlelight. Seamstresses used RAF blankets and uniforms to stitch together German civilian clothes. Then there were the bartering specialists, men fluent in German who befriended guards, offering coffee, cigarettes, or chocolate in exchange for paper, compasses, and even train schedules. Watchmen were posted at every major area of camp activity. Their job: monitor guard movement and signal the tunnelers to hide whenever a patrol came near. These were ordinary men executing a plan with military-level precision. Stalag Luft III had become an underground city of resistance, a production line of rebellion. But to build such a city, the prisoners needed supplies. and they found a genius way to get them from their captors. When bedboards mysteriously went missing, the Germans replaced them without question. When chairs broke, new ones were sent in. Hundreds of mattresses, tables, and blankets disappeared into the tunnel network. Soup fat from meals was skimmed, hardened, and shaped into candles. The very structures meant to confine the prisoners were being dismantled piece by piece and refashioned into escape tools. Even Red Cross parcels, designed to offer humanitarian relief, became covert treasure troves. Items inside were bartered with sympathetic guards or repurposed for escape. Tinned food provided energy for the long journeys ahead. Empty cans became part of the ventilation system. Clothing was dyed and resewn into disguises. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the Nazis had seen. At its height, Tunnel Harry stretched over 110 meters, reaching beyond the perimeter fence and into what the escapees hoped would be safety. It was, by every measure, one of the most complex and audacious escape efforts in history. And it was nearly ready. The prisoners set a date: March 24th, 1944. The moon would be dim. Patrols could be predicted. Train schedules had been mapped out. Travel papers forged. Civilian clothes stitched. Tunnel lighting tested. Every detail was in place. But war doesn't care about plans. And when the big night finally arrived, even the best-laid plans faced disaster. The Great Escape begins. The night of March 24th, 1944, was bitterly cold, one of the coldest winters Central Europe had seen in over 30 years. Snow blanketed the pine forest around Stalag Luft 3, and the wind howled through the trees. But for the men in Hut 104, the cold didn't matter. This was the night they had dreamed of for nearly a year. This was the moment when months of digging, forging, sewing, and scheming would finally pay off. They were about to vanish beneath the wire, one by one. At 8:45 p.m., the first escapees quietly lifted the trap door beneath the stove and slipped into Tunnel Harry. The plan was to move quickly and quietly, allowing around 200 men to escape before dawn. But then came the first setback, a critical one. The exit shaft had frozen. The wooden slats covering the tunnel's end were waterlogged and jammed. It took almost 45 minutes to pry them open. By the time they finally broke through, it was already after 10 p.m. And worse, the exit point was not where they had expected it to be. Their calculations had been precise, but they had misjudged the length. Instead of emerging safely inside the forest tree line, the shaft opened in no man's land, an open stretch of snowy ground between the camp fence and the forest. A dangerous void patrolled by German sentries. It was a terrifying revelation, but turning back was not an option. The sentries passed by in regular intervals, and the plan adapted. One man would emerge only when the lookout, stationed in a camouflaged nest near the tree line, gave the all-clear by tugging a rope tied to a signal inside the tunnel. The first few escapees slipped out successfully. They moved fast, low to the ground, and disappeared into the dark. But the delay had eaten into their schedule. They now had barely 7 hours of darkness left. They had originally hoped to get one man out every minute, but the new limitations brought that number down drastically, just 10 men per hour. Inside the tunnel, prisoners lay in tightly packed rows, inching forward on their backs, face to feet. The air was tight, the space claustrophobic. They passed bags, clothes, forged papers, and travel kits forward on a small trolley. Every movement was choreographed. Every minute mattered. By 4:55 a.m., 76 men had successfully made it out of the tunnel and into the snow. But then, disaster. One man misread the signal rope and emerged at the wrong moment. Just as he surfaced, a German guard passed by and spotted the movement. There was a beat of silence. Then, a shot rang out. The whistle blew, dogs barked, floodlights swung to life. The entire camp snapped awake in an instant. The great escape was over. Back inside the compound, the scene erupted into quiet chaos. Prisoners scrambled to hide evidence. They burned documents, destroyed forged papers, and returned to their bunks, pretending to sleep. Guards rushed through the huts, demanding names, searching for clues. But the tunnel's entrance remained hidden for hours. It was chaos and camouflage. No one knew exactly how many had escaped. The camp commandant, stunned by the scale of the breach, called for a full roll call. Prisoners shuffled and moved in the snow, deliberately confusing the count. It would take time before the Germans realized just how many had vanished into the night. And out there, in the forests and fields beyond the barbed wire, 76 men split into small groups, clutching maps and forged IDs, shivering in stolen coats. Some aimed for the Baltic ports. Others hoped to catch trains toward Switzerland or the Balkans. A few tried to walk straight across Germany. They believed the hardest part was over. Some thought freedom was within reach. They had no idea a death sentence had already been signed. Hitler's fury and the 50 executions. When word of the escape reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler exploded in fury. The scale of the breakout stunned the Nazi leadership. Not 5 or 10 prisoners, but 76 had slipped past guards, towers, and microphones under the cover of night. It wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a public humiliation, a direct challenge to Nazi control. And Hitler, as always, demanded blood in return. At first, he ordered all 76 escapees to be executed. He saw them not as prisoners of war, but as insurgents, saboteurs who had violated the sanctity of his Reich. Cooler heads in the high command, including Hermann Göring, eventually convinced him to reduce the number. But even the compromise was monstrous. 50 men were to be neutralized. No trial, no defense, just names selected from a list and a quiet, deliberate slaughter. These were not battlefield deaths. These were not battlefield deaths. These weren't soldiers dying in combat. They were unarmed airmen, men who had been captured, imprisoned, and protected under the Geneva Convention. They were supposed to be returned to their barracks if caught. Instead, they were marked for death by the state that had imprisoned them. The method of execution was as cold and calculated as the order itself. Most of the recaptured men were told they were being transported back to Stalag Luft III. They were loaded into cars, often handcuffed, and driven into the countryside. Somewhere along the route, the vehicle would stop under the pretense of allowing the prisoner to stretch or relieve himself. The Gestapo officers would lead him a few paces away from the road, then shoot him in the back of the head. Some were buried on the spot. Others were cremated, their ashes returned to the camp in urns. Each death was reported back to the Luftwaffe command under the same lie: shot while trying to escape. A phrase meant to sanitize an atrocity, but not everyone bought the story. Swiss inspectors visiting Stalag Luft III quickly became suspicious. So did senior British officers. The numbers didn't add up. The timelines were wrong. Survivors who had been captured and spared noticed discrepancies and strange behavior. The air around the camp grew heavy with dread, until finally, the truth began to emerge. When the war ended, the British government made a vow. These tragic losses would not be forgotten. The task of uncovering the truth fell to Frank McKenna, a former detective and wartime intelligence officer. He led one of the most extensive post-war investigations into Nazi war crimes. tracking down Gestapo agents across a shattered Europe. Piece by piece, McKenna and his team uncovered what had really happened. The confessions were chilling. Some officers admitted they had been ordered to carry out the slayings against their will. Others showed no remorse. Several of those responsible were eventually brought to trial at Nuremberg, including the man who executed Roger Buschel, the very architect of the escape. 13 Gestapo officials were sentenced to death. Others received lengthy prison terms. The deaths of the 50 airmen became one of the most widely condemned Nazi war crimes of the entire war. Not because of the number neutralized, but because of the cold, bureaucratic precision with which it was done. This wasn't a crime of passion or panic. It was a decision made at the highest level of the Nazi regime and carried out with grim efficiency. The executions sent a brutal message to all POWs still behind barbed wire. Escape again, and this will be your fate. But the message didn't work. Back at Stalag Luft 3, the surviving prisoners mourned their lost comrades and began to plan their next tunnel. They would not be broken. Still, one chilling fact remained. Not all of the 76 were accounted for. Some vanished entirely. Their names stayed on lists, their fates unknown. For decades, families waited for answers that never came. Yet some of those 76 never came home and were never found until decades later. The three who made it. Out of the 76 brave men who crawled through Tunnel Harry and vanished into the darkness beyond Stalag Luft 3, only 3 ever made it home. Just 3. The rest were either captured, neutralized, or lost to time. But those 3 proved it was possible, not just to escape, but to survive behind enemy lines, through Nazi territory, in one of the most heavily surveilled parts of Europe. The first 2 were Jens Müller and Per Bergsland, both Norwegian pilots. Fluent in German and experienced in navigating occupied regions, they managed to avoid detection by blending in as laborers. After escaping the camp, they found shelter in freight rail cars heading north. Their forged documents and accents held up during inspections, and they slowly made their way toward the Baltic Sea. Their goal was the port city of Stettin, where neutral Swedish ships sometimes docked. After several close calls and tense days in hiding, they reached the harbor. There, with the help of sympathetic contacts and incredible luck, they were smuggled aboard a Swedish vessel. Once the ship set sail, they were finally out of Hitler's grasp. From Sweden, they were flown to Britain, heroes who had lived to tell the tale. The third man to make it out was Bram van der Stok, a Dutch RAF pilot and ace fighter with 6 confirmed neutralizations. His escape was a masterclass in patience, adaptability, and nerve. He journeyed across Nazi-occupied Europe alone, changing identities as needed. In the Netherlands, he linked up with underground resistance networks. They helped him move from safe house to safe house, evading Gestapo sweeps and informants. He crossed into Belgium, then into France. Resistance fighters guided him to the Pyrenees Mountains, where he endured a grueling trek into neutral Spain. From there, he reached Gibraltar, and finally, after weeks of running, hiding, and narrowly escaping death, he made it back to Britain. He was the only Dutchman to complete the escape and return. But while the stories of those 3 are legendary, they are also the rare exception. For most of the other escapees, the journey was a nightmare of narrow escapes that eventually turned to dead ends. The cold was unforgiving. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, forcing escapees to seek shelter wherever they could. Barns, sheds, abandoned train stations. Unfortunately, these were the very places German patrols searched first. Even the smallest mistakes proved fatal. A mispronounced word, an old document, a jacket buttoned the wrong way. Several escapees were arrested within miles of the camp. Others made it hundreds of miles before being recognized. Some were betrayed by civilians, some were simply unlucky. And then there were those who seemed to vanish completely. For years, decades even, families of the missing received no updates. No official cause of death, no location of burial. Some were returned in urns, their names scrawled on labels. Others were never found at all. The silence was often the hardest part. Letters home, once full of hope and love, stopped arriving. Wives, children, and parents clung to rumors and whispers. Some held out hope long after the war ended. And for many, closure never came. Official records listed neutralized while escaping, but the truth was buried, both literally and bureaucratically. It wasn't until years after the war that the executions of the 50 were confirmed through war crime investigations. Even then, the exact locations, dates, and final moments of many victims remained a mystery. But recently, historians uncovered something hidden in the archives, something the world had never seen before. Hidden documents and a new investigation. For years after the war, the fate of many of the great escapees remained murky, a fog of uncertainty cloaking their final days. Families were given vague answers. Governments shared only partial truths. And for most, the legacy of the escape lived on through Hollywood fiction, not verified history. But hidden in dusty archives, locked behind bureaucratic layers, were documents that told a very different story. It began with the quiet release of classified wartime files decades after Germany's surrender. Some were discovered in British government vaults, others in the abandoned offices of Soviet-occupied territories, and a few tucked away in local municipal buildings across Germany and Poland. These were not just dusty reports. They contained names, transport logs, Gestapo communications, and even maps marking execution sites. What emerged wasn't merely a clearer picture, it was a trail, a breadcrumb path back to the final footsteps of the 50th amateur historians, military researchers, and descendants of the executed men began to connect the dots. What had once been treated as a mass wartime tragedy was now being broken down into individual journeys. They weren't just numbers. They were men with roots, decisions, betrayals, and, in some cases, recorded last words. Soon, modern forensic teams joined the effort. They returned to the forests, the ditches, and the side roads where the Gestapo had carried out their slayings. Armed with metal detectors, geolocation software, and original German road maps from the 1940s, they scoured regions long untouched. In some places, they found what was left: scattered bullet casings, a scrap of fabric, a faded ID tag. In one instance, near a remote stretch of road outside Görlitz, a buried uniform button with RAF insignia led searchers to a shallow grave. The remains were later identified as one of the missing escapees, reburied under the Royal Air Force crest in a nearby military cemetery. Elsewhere, bones found in unmarked pits were carefully exhumed, tested, and, when possible, matched to families still alive. Some funerals happened 70 years after the man had disappeared. Flags were raised, salutes were made, and silence, once used to bury shame, became a moment of long-awaited honor. But not all were found. Some trails ended in burned records or in towns destroyed by later Soviet advances. Some names remain etched on memorials without a known grave. Even now, the search continues. Yet with each document, each discovered site, the story shifted. These weren't simply escaped prisoners gunned down in the dark. They were resistance fighters. They disrupted Nazi resources. They forced the Germans to reallocate tens of thousands of soldiers in search operations. They risked execution not just to survive, but to serve. And even in death, they succeeded. The Great Escape was never meant to be about numbers. It was about defiance. Every forged passport, every rail map memorized, every tunnel inch dug by candlelight, it was all part of a larger war fought in silence. And once the records began to speak again, the world listened. Monuments were restored, names added to walls. In Poland, at the site of the former camp, memorial stones were etched not just with dates, but with full stories. And in Britain, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands, families once left with ashes and silence were finally given names, locations, and medals. It was a story retold, not for drama, but for justice. Yet even in death, the story wasn't over. Some prisoners inside the camp had already begun digging. Again. The escape that came after. The Nazis thought they had made their point. 50 men executed. A gruesome message broadcast across Europe's prison camps. Posters were issued, rumors were spread, and a chilling phrase echoed from barracks to barracks. Escape is no longer a sport. But inside the barbed wire fences of Stalag Luft III, defiance didn't die. The surviving prisoners mourned, yes, some wept, some went silent, but none surrendered their will. The Gestapo's cruelty had backfired, it had hardened resolve instead of crushing it. Less than a month after the mass execution, a new tunnel project quietly began beneath the huts of the northern compound. This one had no fanfare, no wide support. Fewer men were involved, and secrecy was tighter than ever. But it was happening. The digging continued. They weren't escaping for personal freedom anymore. They were escaping for the fallen. Every handful of sand moved in the dark was an act of tribute, a refusal to let tyranny win. The guards didn't relax either. After the escape, the Nazis intensified their surveillance. More patrols, more searches. The entire layout of the camp changed. But even with increased restrictions, the surviving POWs found ways to resist. They carved spoons into shovels, made air pumps from bed slats, and forged papers in the shadows. They hoarded chocolate bars to trade with guards and counted footsteps between patrols with the precision of trained scouts. Because now, escape wasn't just a plan, it was a principle. Escape is no longer a sport. The phrase was meant to scare them, to imply that trying again would mean certain death. But to the prisoners, that phrase became something else entirely. A lie, a dare, a challenge. Because they had never thought of it as sport in the first place. It was always rebellion. Every tunnel dug was a middle finger to the regime that tried to strip them of their agency. Every forged document was a strike against a system that sought to erase their names. Every foot of progress made underground was a reminder that they still controlled something, their choices. The Nazis locked the doors, but the prisoners found ways to crawl beneath them. And when people today think of the Great Escape, they often remember the movie, the motorcycle stunts, the Hollywood dramatization, Steve McQueen flying over barbed wire, chasing freedom across green hills. But the real legacy has nothing to do with stuntmen or cinematic flair. It's the story of 600 men in a forest, most with nothing more than spoons, stolen wire, and an unbreakable sense of purpose. It's the memory of men like Roger Bushell, who knew he might not make it, but led the charge anyway. It's the roar of defiance buried in whispers, passed through tunnels, written in false identities, carried across frozen fields and into the hearts of free nations. And most of all, it's the legacy of those 50, the ones who never came back, who made the ultimate sacrifice not because they had to, but because they refused to kneel. In the decades since, their story has continued to grow. More names unearthed, more records uncovered, more secrets brought into the light. Not just a tale of escape, but of resistance, sacrifice, and the enduring fire of freedom. If this story moved you, share it. Let their names be remembered for what they truly were: warriors who kept fighting, even without a weapon in hand. Like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories that history nearly forgot. And don't miss the next video on your screen. Another true chapter, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered.